The new church advantage. Influencing the community at large. There is no question that starting a new church is the easiest and best way to do it. More converts to Christ are made in new churches than in old ones. But starting a church is not easy. It takes a genuine call of God, as well as a lot of time, patience, effort, and a particular set of skills that are not found in every pastor. In this video, we're going to be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of new church plants, what it takes to do it, and also we're going to be looking at some of the models of church planting that are common in the church. Why start new churches? There's a lot of reasons for starting churches. The main reason is that they are more advantageous to winning people to the gospel than existing churches. A recent study by Duke University of more than 100 churches in 32 countries showed that new churches are 16 times more likely to attract new people than established ones. Most churches do not grow into big churches, so we need more of them. More than half of all the churches are fewer than 75 members in attendance, and 90% have fewer than 350 people attending. Small churches engage their members more than large ones. A larger percentage of members are involved in active ministries in small churches than in large churches. New churches allow for the growth of a pastor's personal vision. A church planter is not burdened by the assumptions of traditions of the past. New churches do not have to have buildings, maintenance, or locations. They can be in centers of commerce where they naturally will meet the lost. New churches are visionary churches. Not only the pastor, but the people who attend new churches tend to be idealistic, forward-thinking people to want to build something new for the body of Christ. New churches are also desperate churches. They have to grow, and so they'll be willing to take risks that traditional churches or established churches will not, because they have nothing to lose in the attempt. They're more likely to step out on faith. So what does it take to start a new church? Just because new churches are more effective in growing doesn't mean that you should start one. New churches are planted at a very high cost, both financially, emotionally, and spiritually. You need to count the cost before you start to build a new church. Let's look at the financial costs of starting a new church. They include the church's personal and family support. A church planter, in order to be effective, has to fit culturally with the people he's trying to reach. That means that if he's from a poor family, he must be able to raise money so that he can live to the expected standard of those that he's trying to reach. Poor church planters are hampered when they're trying to reach middle class or upper class people. And the reverse is also true. If a pastor is living at a higher socioeconomic level, he may have to sacrifice that level to get down to where the people are, so that he can be one among them. Then there's the price of conferences and schooling that he must attend. He needs to be reading many books, going to websites, and joining organizations and going to conferences that are available to help church planters. There's plenty of them out there, but most of them cost money. The church must be willing to pay. The church planter must be willing to pay to do that. Unless your goal is to start a small house church, it's unlikely that you're going to be successful without going through training, coaching, and mentoring for church planting. Then there's the cost of insurance, of savings, and of retirement. Church planters are notorious for being poor managers of their money. They tend to live by faith and assume that tomorrow will take care of itself, but the majority of them find out that this just is not the case. Money worries will hamper your growth as a church planter, and you're able to work. If you're worried so much about tomorrow, you'll not be able to pay attention to today. And one of the greatest discouragements that church planters find is that when they have needs that cannot be met because they have put all their money up front. Many denominations will not allow planters to plant. under their auspices without having insurance and retirement benefits in place and being paying into those. Then there's the problem of debt. And this is a big problem. Debt is one of the major enemies of church planting. Debt is always a form of bondage. It makes us servant to our debtors and not to God. Some people mistakenly regard going into debt as an act of faith, since we're borrowing against the future to finance present ministry. But God is the provider, not banks or credit card companies when it comes to church planting. If we find ourselves taking on a large burden of debt to banks and credit card companies and to others to finance our education, buildings, or our daily life while we're planting churches, we're not allowing God to provide. But in our haste, we are making assumptions and presumptions upon God when God may have other plans for our future. Indebtedness crushes many church plants because of the great cost associated with ministry. Then there are ministry expenses, such as, for example, advertising. In today's world, church planters are competing against each other for the attention of people, as well as competing against secular companies that are also in the advertising field. That means that church planters need to have good advertising and professional-looking pieces when they go out and present to the world. There's also the cost of meeting facilities, and sometimes this is extremely high. There are church plants in many places that have been hampered because the meeting facilities that they had to have were extravagantly high in price, and that has to be paid. There's the cost of chairs and other furnishings for a church plant. There's the cost of worship equipment for church plants. There's the cost of office equipment for church plants. There's the cost of teaching materials, and all of these things have to be taken care of. There's also the cost of a permanent home. One day the church will need to move into a permanent facility, and that's going to cost money. And if you're an urban church planter, you may never be able to afford to buy land where you are, but you do need some kind of permanent home for your church eventually. Financial cost is only one of the costs. There's also the emotional cost. One of those emotional costs is loneliness. Many church planters have been surprised when they begin to start working in church plants how lonely and isolated they become, especially if they've been used to working in large churches where everything has been provided for them and where there are people around to support them. It's extremely important that church planters be involved in a network for mutual support and friendship with other pastors and with church leaders. The loneliness of a church planter can sometimes be extreme. Then there are family issues. It's not just the church planter that feels that loneliness, but also his children and his families, as they're taken away from youth groups and taken away from women's groups, and they are put out into a field where none of that exists. Oftentimes, that loneliness can truly be a problem. Then there's discouragement. If you're out planting churches and you're talking to people about going to church, you have to realize that more people are going to reject your invitation to come than will accept it. And if you're a person who's easily discouraged by people rejecting you, you're going to have trouble as a church planter. Many of your core people will wind up leaving you for easier and other work as the plant progresses. Many times people to whom you have devoted hours of ministry will wind up going someplace else. In large established churches, there's plenty of people around to encourage and support you. But in small and new churches, you often have to bear that almost alone. To avoid that, you need three kinds of support. You're going to need coaching. That's somebody who can come alongside of you and help you to fulfill the goals that you have and be a good coach. You're also going to need a mentor. That's somebody who's been through what you've been through and can encourage you towards finding the pitfalls. And you're also going to need counseling. Sooner or later, you're going to become so frustrated that you may need to go see a counselor. You better get used to that right now because it will happen. Since depression is much more common among church planters and pastors at large, be prepared to go to a counselor if you need it. The odds are that you and or your family will become discouraged at some time and may need counseling. This is not a weakness to go to counseling, it's a strength. A serious church planter will seek whatever help they need emotionally to get through the areas of life. There's also spiritual costs that have to be taken into consideration. we must be honest about it. Most church plants are going to fail. One often repeated figure is that 80% of church plants fail. One report by the North American Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Church is more optimistic and says that 68% survive into the fourth year. But this figure only includes churches that have more than 40 within 1 year time, and it does not include churches that are 5 years or older. Overwhelming evidence suggests that if you attempt to start an independent church without a core, that you are more likely to fail. These failures are not because of lack of faith, and they're not because of sin in your life, but they're because the world rejects the gospel. In the Bible, we read about many martyrs who were faithful and yet died anyway. Church plants sometimes die and are martyred because the people to whom they are trying to serve have rejected the gospel. Nevertheless, it's our job to tell. And God may have called you to be that witness that fails. There's a great spiritual cost in that. A church planter must realize that failure is an option, that God may call us out there, and in spite of our best efforts and in spite of a legitimate calling, we may not succeed. Failure is not necessarily your fault, however, and we need to keep that in mind. Our success or failure is in God's hands. A church planter must be a realistic risk taker. We must be prepared to take a risk, even though we are not necessarily guaranteed success at everything. A church planter must be a self-starter. A church planter must not be easily discouraged when things go wrong. A church planter must have a strong personal devotional life. That's going to take time out of your schedule to spend time with God, but you have to spend it as a church planter. A church planter needs to have an optimistic outlook on life. A church planter's got to have a good sense of humor. That's essential if you're going to be able to survive as a church planter. And you've got to have a strong support network of prayer partners, coaches, and mentors, and peers who can hold you up when you're feeling down. All of those are the costs that go with planting a church. Now let's talk briefly about some of the models of church planting, at least 4 of them that are prevalent today. Probably the most effective one is called the mother church model. And this is a model in which a church sends out a portion of their membership to start a new church, usually between 50 and 200 people, to form the nucleus of a new church. Now, the advantage of this is, first of all, this is the easiest model to succeed. By the time you have that many people coming out and they're good workers, it's pretty easy to be able to organize them into a church. This kind of church has financial and spiritual backing of an established work, and this makes it more viable. The biggest problem with it is that oftentimes it's hard to get those 50 to 200 people because people do not want to leave their established home churches. The second problem that comes with that is that the people who are more likely to leave established churches are the disgruntled ones, and they're the ones that leave first. So oftentimes church plants begin with a group of disgruntled people that have to be dealt with. Often, too, they keep the same problems as the old church. They try to make a clone of the old church, and that sometimes doesn't work. A church plant has to have its own unique vision. Nevertheless, the mother church model is probably the most effective. The next most effective is the multiple church model, in which many churches in an area band together to plant a new church in their midst. Now, that has great advantages. For one thing, it's got plenty of resources. You've got several congregations that can help you with that. The biggest disadvantage, of course, is that none of those particular churches have an ownership of the work. They may not feel that same connectedness that they have if that is their daughter church. A third kind of church planter is what I call the lone wolf church plant. It's simply a visionary person or persons who plant a church on their own without any help. Well, this has some advantages to it. First of all, it is effective if the desire is for a small house church. This can be quite effective. You can begin immediately in your work. Big disadvantages to this, though. One of them is that there are no funds or support. You have to do it all. You have to raise the money. You have to go out and do everything yourself. And the other disadvantage to the Lone Wolf Church plan is that with no group sponsoring or certifying the pastor, it's easy for it to become cultish. You need to have people to whom you are answering on a regular basis. The last kind of church plant is the parachute drop church plant. Now, this is where a church planter or planters are paid a salary and sent into a neighborhood or town where there is no church to build a church. They are essentially a missionary to a different town or a different part of town. The sending churches support them like a missionary, offering what help they can, and the people who plant the church go back to the sponsoring church or organization and report from time to time and are under their authority. Now, it has some advantages to it, certainly. The mission developer has financial backing of churches to go out and start something in a new area. The mission developer has been screened, approved, and commissioned. The mission developer has prayer and spiritual support. There are also some huge disadvantages with this as well. It is the hardest kind of plant to succeed, since missionary churches do not have the local backing of somebody in the community before they go. They are often wasteful both of money and of people. They may struggle to start a church in a particular area, and after several years of trying, find out that they cannot do it. And a lot of money and people and time has been put into it, and with nothing to show for it. Mission developers have time and money and pressure, and they have to eventually be able to raise that, but yet they have little certainty of success, so it can be some of the most nerve-wracking ways of starting a new church. You are accountable to the people who send you, and they expect results, whether you can do it or not. In spite of all the problems I've described that involve starting a new church, it really is the most effective way of growing the kingdom of God. But before a person plants, he or she must be sure that they have a call of God, that their personal gifts have been affirmed and strengthened by others, and that they have a plan which includes resources and finances and personal support. Don't start a new church until you've examined yourself and are prepared. There are many organizations out there that can assist you in planting new churches, but do your homework and prepare spiritually, emotionally, and physically for the building of a new church for the kingdom of God.